All right, let's dive into something I bet you haven't thought much about. Brake dust. And we all know about car exhaust being a big polluter. But there's this other sneaky culprit, hiding in plain sight, right under our noses. You know that black grime that builds up on your wheels. Yeah, that's brake dust. And it's a major contributor to air pollution. About 20% of all fine particulate matter. Actually, and here's something that might surprise you, even electric cars produce brake dust. So no vehicle is truly zero emission when it comes to this hidden polluter. So today, we're going to take a deep dive into what brake dust is, how it impacts your health, and what research is being done to tackle this growing problem. So let's break down what brake dust actually is and why it's such a big deal. Basically, every time you hit your brakes, tiny metal particles wear off your brake pads and rotors, creating a cloud of dust. Now, you might be thinking, dust, how bad can it be? Well, it turns out these microscopic metal particles are a major component of something called fine particulate matter, or PM 2.5.
That's right, and PM 2.5 is a serious health concern. Because these particles are so small, they can actually bypass your body's natural defenses and lodge deep in your lungs.
Okay, so breathing in metal dust doesn't sound great, but how exactly does it affect our health? Well, Article 1 paints a pretty vivid picture. It describes how these metal particles, especially when they react with other pollutants in the air, can create a toxic aerosol that irritates and inflames your lungs. And they even have a name for it in London. London throat. Ever felt that scratchy frog in your throat feeling after being stuck in traffic? Yeah, that could be brake dust messing with your vocal cords.
And it's not just a temporary annoyance. Prolonged exposure to brake dust has been linked to some serious respiratory problems like bronchitis and pneumonia. And there's even emerging research suggesting a connection between brake dust and a weakened immune system.
Wow, so this seemingly invisible dust is packing a real punch. And it's not just about exhaust fumes anymore, right?
Right, that's a key takeaway from Article 2. While we've made significant strides in reducing exhaust emissions, non-exhaust sources like brake dust are becoming the dominant source of vehicle particulate matter in some areas. And what's even more alarming is that recent research has shown that brake dust from certain types of brake pads can be even more toxic to lung cells than diesel exhaust.
Hold on. More toxic than diesel exhaust? That's a pretty shocking statement. What makes brake dust so potent?
Well, it all comes down to the composition of the brake pads. The study highlighted in Article 2 focused on the toxicity of different brake pad materials, and they found that non-asbestos organic brake pads, which are pretty common, release a lot of copper when they wear down.
So the copper in brake dust is the main culprit. I guess that makes sense. Copper is a metal. But why is copper so much worse than other metals?
It's not just about the copper itself, but how it reacts with other compounds in the air. Copper, when combined with certain pollutants, can trigger a cascade of chemical reactions that creates a particularly harmful type of particulate matter.
So it'd have a toxic cocktail, with copper being the key ingredient. That's pretty scary stuff. But before we get too bogged down in the doom and gloom, are researchers doing anything to address this copper conundrum?
Absolutely. And that leads us to Article 3, which highlights the groundbreaking research being done in California, a state that's really at the forefront of tackling non-exhaust emissions.
So what exactly are they doing out there on the West Coast?
Well, they've got this ambitious project underway to actually measure real-world brake and tire dust emissions, which might sound simple, but it's actually incredibly complex.
I can imagine. It's not like exhaust fumes, where you can just stick a sensor in the tailpipe, right?
Exactly. There are so many variables to consider with brake dust. Driving styles, brake pad materials, weather conditions, the types of roads you're driving on. It's a real challenge to isolate and measure these emissions accurately.
So how are they tackling this measurement puzzle?
Well, they're using a combination of sophisticated sensors and modeling techniques. They've even built these special tunnels where they can drive cars through and measure the dust particles in a controlled environment. And they're not just focusing on the quantity of dust, but also the composition, the types of metals and other compounds present.
Oh, that makes sense. After all, we learned that not all brake dust is created equal, right? The copper content seems to be a major factor in its toxicity.
Precisely. And that's why this research is so critical. By understanding the real-world emissions from different brake pads and driving conditions, we can start to develop strategies to reduce the most harmful types of brake dust.
So it's like a detective story, trying to track down the source of the problem and find ways to prevent it.
That's a great analogy. And like any good detective story, this one has some twists and turns. For example, one of the studies they're conducting in California is looking at the impact of metallic brake pads, the kind often found on heavier vehicles like trucks and SUVs.
Oh, interesting. So is there something different about metallic brake pads that makes them worse?
Well, it turns out that metallic brake pads tend to emit larger particles and more overall dust compared to other types of pads. And those larger particles, while they might not penetrate as deeply into the lungs, can still cause irritation and contribute to overall air pollution.
So it's not just about the type of metal, but also the size of the particles. It seems like there's a lot more to brake dust than meets the eye. But knowing all this, what does it mean for us? What can we as individuals do to minimize our own brake dust footprint?
That's a great question. And it brings us back to Article 1, which offers some practical advice that anyone can follow. First and foremost, make sure your brakes are properly maintained. Worn-out brake pads and sticking calipers can significantly increase dust production.
So regular brake checks and servicing are essential, not just for safety, but for the environment as well.
Absolutely. And when it comes time to replace your brake pads, consider choosing ceramic brake pads over semi-metallic ones. Ceramic pads generally produce less dust and are less likely to contain those high levels of copper we talked about earlier.
So a simple swap can make a difference. It's like choosing a fuel-efficient car or using energy-saving appliances. Small choices can add up to a big impact. But I'm curious, is there anything beyond maintenance and choosing the right brake pads? Could our driving habits play a role in reducing brake dust?
That's an interesting question, and one that researchers are exploring.
So could things like smoother braking or anticipating stops actually make a difference?
While those techniques can certainly help reduce wear and tear on your brakes overall, and therefore potentially reduce dust production, the composition of the brake pad itself still plays the most significant role in the overall toxicity of the dust.
That makes sense. It's like choosing organic produce over conventionally grown. Sometimes the materials matter just as much as our actions, but I have to admit, I'm still a little concerned about this whole copper issue. Are there any technological breakthroughs on the horizon that could offer a more comprehensive solution?
There are definitely some exciting developments in the works, and that leads us perfectly into our next segment where we'll explore the potential of nanotechnology and other innovations to tackle the brake dust challenge.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. So we've talked about the problem of brake dust, the health risks, and some things you can do to minimize your impact. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about some of the cutting-edge solutions being developed. In this final segment, we're strapping on our futuristic goggles and diving into the world of nanotechnology.
Right. Nanotechnology is a fascinating field with huge potential to revolutionize many industries, and brake technology is no exception.
So what exactly is nanotechnology, and how can it help us tackle this brake dust issue?
Well, nanotechnology essentially involves manipulating materials at an incredibly small scale, at the level of atoms and molecules. Think 1,000 times smaller than the width of a human hair.
Wow, that's tiny. So how does that apply to brake pads?
Well, imagine we could engineer brake pad materials at the nanoscale to make them less harmful. For instance, some nanomaterials have a much larger surface area compared to their volume.
Okay, so bigger surface area, how does that help?
Think of it like a sponge. A sponge with lots of tiny pores can absorb more liquid than a smooth surface. In the same way, a brake pad made with a nanomaterial with a large surface area could potentially trap and absorb more of those harmful particles before they're released into the air.
So it's like building a microscopic filter right into the brake pad itself. That's pretty ingenious. Are there any other nanotech tricks up their sleeves?
Researchers are also experimenting with nanomaterials that can actually break down the harmful compounds in brake dust, making them less toxic. It's almost like having tiny little cleanup crews working at the molecular level.
An army of nanobots fighting pollution? I love it. It seems like nanotechnology holds a lot of promise. But what about other innovations? Are there any completely new approaches to brake design that could help reduce brake dust?
There is. One really interesting area of research is focused on regenerative braking systems. These systems are already being used in electric and hybrid vehicles.
I've heard of regenerative braking. Doesn't it have something to do with capturing energy?
Exactly. Instead of relying solely on friction to slow down a vehicle, regenerative braking systems capture the kinetic energy generated during braking and convert it back into electricity.
So instead of all that energy being wasted as heat and dust, it's actually being reused. That sounds almost too good to be true.
It's a win-win situation. Not only does regenerative braking reduce reliance on traditional friction brakes, which means less wear and tear and less dust, but it also boosts energy efficiency.
So with regenerative braking, we get cleaner air and better mileage. Sign me up. Are there any challenges to implementing this technology more widely?
Well, regenerative braking systems are most effective at lower speeds. Traditional friction brakes are still necessary for things like emergency stops and high-speed braking.
That makes sense. You need that stopping power when it really counts. But it sounds like regenerative braking has the potential to significantly reduce our dependence on friction brakes, and therefore brake dust.
Absolutely. As the technology continues to evolve, we can expect to see even greater efficiency and a further reduction in brake dust emissions.
It's amazing to think about how far we've come with brake technology. From clunky mechanical brakes to these sophisticated systems that can recapture energy, it really speaks to human ingenuity.
It also highlights the importance of continued research and innovation. We have the power to solve these complex challenges if we invest in finding solutions.
Well said. So let's wrap things up. What are the key takeaways from our deep dive into the world of brake dust?
I think the biggest takeaway is that brake dust is a serious issue, but it's not insurmountable.
Right, and we can all take steps to minimize our impact.
Absolutely. Everything from regular maintenance and choosing the right brake pads to supporting advancements in technology can make a difference.
It's empowering to know that we're not just passengers on this ride. We can make choices that contribute to a cleaner, healthier world. And on that note, we'll wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the often overlooked world of brake dust. Until next time, stay curious.